front.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Biggest Exclusive tonight with me, Akanksha Swaroop. Now today, Russia is annexing the Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine. This after holding what it called referendums in occupied areas of Ukraine. Now Kyiv and the Western governments have called these referendums a sham. They say the votes have breached international law. The West has called Russia's move coercive and non-representative. But Russia has gone ahead with the annexation today in a ceremony in the St. George's Hall of the Grand Kremlin Palace that you can see on your screens today. Now, it should also be noted that today's ceremony takes place 8 years after Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine. So the question that we are going to ask is, will the annexation now only prolong this war that is already 7 months down? All right, so let's also try and bring you the areas that we are looking at in terms of annexation today. This has been a big move. As we said, the first historic move was when Crimea was annexed by Russia. And today, this is a look of Russia's annexation. Remember, now Russia, after this annexation, will be occupying almost 18% of Ukraine. And that's massive in terms of the war. Crimea annexed in 2014 already. Then let's also look at the other regions that will be annexed. We are looking at Luhansk and Donetsk, which have already been the separatist areas. That is the Donbas region as far as Luhansk and Donetsk is concerned. Zaporizhzhia, again, a very crucial area. Remember, the nuclear reactor happens to be there. It's equally fragile, and the UN was pushing for this area to be a military-free zone. But what happens to this fragile area now is something that we'll have to look at. Kherson is another region that has been declared independent along with Zaporizhzhia. What is the big picture of the annexation today? Russian flag over nearly 100,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. As I told you, that is 18% of Ukraine now under Russia's control already. Putin's message is very clear. The attack on Russian territory will invite full retaliation. Of course, he's also gone ahead and threatened nuclear action as well. Thirdly, Putin's ratings had spiked post-2014 Crimea annexation. Will this happen again? Because as we all know, previous polls were indicating that Putin's popularity was dipping down. But the current annexation, will this bring his popularity back? Let's not forget there have been protests going on already in Russia. Now, fourthly, annexation has made the negotiation impossible. That's what Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has to say. Fifth, test of Russia's red line soon as Ukraine keeps up the offensive. What we'll have to watch out is whether Ukraine will manage to step up its offensive and to what extent will NATO go to defend Ukraine. Let's try and get a sense of ground zero. And for that, I'm joined in by Sanjay Suri. Remember, CNN News 18 is one of the few channels who have sent someone to cover this war. And Sanjay Suri happens to join me live from Kharkiv. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for joining the broadcast today. Now, since you are there, what has been the sentiment and the situation on ground level? We've seen that grand ceremony happen in the Kremlin Palace. It's been a big move. Now that Zaporizhzhia and Kherson have been granted independence, what will this now translate in terms of annexation?
Well, this annexation is in name only. This is a claim that has been made by Putin. Certainly, it is not going to be accepted in Ukraine. President Zelensky has said very firmly, we will not give an inch of territory. Right. He is backed by the US, by Western Europe. And quite apart from that support, for Ukraine against Putin, Putin's own plans seem a little unconvincing. He had said Zaporizhzhia is now Russian territory. Well, that's not quite the case. The center of Zaporizhzhia is controlled by Ukraine. The mayor is Ukrainian. In the Donetsk Republic, we've had one town, Lyman, that has been taken by Ukrainian forces. Russian forces are on the pushback in that town. So these four areas claimed by Putin are not quite entirely controlled by him, not entirely controlled by Russia. So it is a little difficult to figure out at the moment, and we've had no explanation or elucidation from Russian authorities how this split within these regions will be played out, because Russia does not control these regions.
Right.
So is this going to mean that people who are Ukrainian and in these areas become prisoners in effect within these areas? Will the city center of Zaporizhzhia become a prisoner to the rest of Zaporizhzhia controlled by Russians? A lot of these aspects are not very clear, quite apart from the fact that Putin has absolutely no support from this around the world, not even from his closest allies.
And since you spoke about the status of Ukrainians, I'd like to ask you, do people also see the referendums as a sham, which is what the West has also been alleging? Russia, of course, continues to counter by saying that these are not sham referendums.
Well, these cannot really be a matter of opinion. We've had what are claimed to have been referendums, but we've had no transparency in the referendums, no transparency in communication on how these were conducted, who received the ballot papers, no independent oversight, who voted, who did not. The fact is that Russian speaking does not mean Russian supporting necessarily. Here in Kharkiv, a lot of people are Russian speaking. The majority are Russian speaking.
Right.
And yet this is the area where there has been such a strong pushback from Ukraine. So these assumptions that are sometimes made a bit hastily don't quite stand. And then we've had Putin saying all sorts of things about rights and wrongs, about the rights of Russia and the wrongs of the West, as he calls it. But this on a day when civilians were killed in Zaporizhzhia for just going to pick up their relatives. And the same day, there's a rock concert in a Red Square. This does not quite, this kind of triumph, this kind of rhetoric, this kind of concert does not quite sit easy with what he did to the civilians in Zaporizhzhia.
Sanjay, the supporters of Russia always latch on to the argument provided when it comes to the annexation of Crimea. They said that, the world couldn't stop Russia from annexing Crimea from Ukraine. What will the annexation of these four territories now mean, and also the partial mobilization for the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Well, Crimea, Russia got away with. The difference between Crimea and this is that Russia will find it very difficult to get away with this. The kind of solidarity we've seen around the world against this attempt at annexation, we certainly cannot call it an annexation. This kind of unified response and determination against allowing Russia to get away with it is something we've seen now. We haven't seen it before. And whatever the history and whatever the rights and wrongs of the past, people are taking a stand, and they've taken a very firm stand. It's not just the UN Secretary General, it's countries around the world that have taken this stand.
Many thanks to you, Sanjay, for bringing in all those inputs. Stay safe. And with that, let's also open the dais over to our guests. I'm joined in by Mr. Fred Weir, who's a political analyst and a Russian affairs expert. He's joining us live from Russia as well. I'm also joined in by Alexandra Matvichuk, who's the head of the Center of Civil Liberties in Ukraine. I'm also joined in by Ukrainian MP Sviatoslav Yurash, who's joining us on the phone line right now. Many thanks to all three of you for joining. Fred, if I could start with you. Of course, I'm sure the opinion is on the contrary when it comes to Ukraine. But when it comes to the annexation, what's the opinion like within Russia? We've seen all those protests happen. and what happens to the whole process of annexation as far as particularly Zaporizhzhia and Kherson are concerned, because today they've been declared independent?
I think we can all agree that it's illegal under international law.
I'm glad you said that.
And Russia, I think, is aware of that. They have, so in this sense, they are not just annexing these territories, which is the intention, but they are challenging the existing international order. This is true. And it's also true that these territories are active war zones. It's quite extraordinary to do this during, those very territories are still a matter of contest. And so it's hard for me, as long as I've studied Russia, to understand what they are doing. But the import of it will be, from the Russian point of view, to move the border of Russia right up to the front line in the war zone. That will legally enable Russia to use its regular army on those territories, including conscripts. But it will also cement that Russian claim to make it irreversible from their point of view. And this pretty well, if we thought negotiations were possible, and in recent weeks we really haven't, but if we had thought there was any hope for it, that's all gone now.
Right. Alexandra, if I could bring you in on this. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has called Russia's move a violation of international law. If that was the case, now Crimea wouldn't have been annexed. Will this, by any chance, stop Putin?
Well, first of all, I'm also a professor of international law, and I can assure you that the so-called referendums, sham or fake referendums, are nothing but violations of international law, which are obvious to any person. When you violate international law, it is inevitable that sooner or later you'll be punished for that. It will happen, but it might take some time. But what we see now, we see that Russia has already been strategically defeated, and Ukrainian army is very successfully conducting counteroffensive. So it's only a matter of time when the whole territory of Ukraine will be liberated from Russian army, and Russia will be brought to international legal responsibility, including all war criminals, starting with Putin.
Sviatoslav, if I could bring you in on this, if Ukraine was to step up its offensive, it should have been done back in 2014 in the case of Crimea. Many analysts are also posing the question, how will Ukraine be able to defend itself? Now, I know there have been territories which Ukraine has managed to reclaim, but how much of it will be reclaimed in terms of these four very crucial territories now?
With everything, we are the generation that
that question is for Sviatoslav.
Crimea, Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Kharkiv, and every part of Ukraine shall be brought back into Ukraine. We are defending successfully. We are taking the offensive and liberating our territories, be that around our capital in Kyiv, be that around Kharkiv, and now as we push onwards in the south, we are giving Putin all the reasons for why he is desperate to present any kind of results and to his population. The fact on the ground is we are beating him, and we shall continue doing that until Putin leaves our country alone and allows us to decide our own destiny.
Sviatoslav Yurash, I'd also like to ask you, when Putin met Prime Minister Modi, the fact of the matter is that he did say that it is Ukraine which is not open to negotiation. And in fact, President Zelensky has also gone ahead on record and saying that there's no scope left for negotiation. Why so?
Time and time again, Putin demands of Ukraine capitulation of its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and its ability to choose its own alliances. We cannot abrogate our statehood. Mr. Putin wants our nation to be a part of his own project, whatever that project is. He has stated so very clearly. Every single part of international law is about allowing states to choose their destiny, to choose their future. And for us, Mr. Putin's offer of negotiations is nothing but a noose that he wants to tie around our necks. We try negotiating with him. We tried that for 8 years of the Minsk process, when we were promised the restoration of the eastern regions of Ukraine. And nothing happened, time and time again. So now for us, when we are clearly defeating and showing to the world of how empty, how vacuous that dictator is, we will not be stopped until we get our country back.
Fred Bear, if I could bring you in on this, we've heard the Russian president also go on record to admit certain lapses that have happened, whether it is in terms of mobilization, sending more troops to the front lines, or even in terms of why the protests are happening, those arrests during the protests. Is the Russian president right now under pressure? And what, in your opinion, how do you foresee him making his next move?
Well, the mobilization is unrestricted. So he, listening to the Russian media, opposition media, it's quite obvious that Russia is mobilizing millions of troops. Alas, these are completely untrained and unready troops that are basically trying to find every way to not be a part of this unnecessary conflict. And the fact on the ground is that those Russian troops are getting defeated in every part of Ukraine. So I'm not sure how these troops, which are unwilling
Yurash, I'm going to request you to hold on to those thoughts. That question was in fact for Fred Weir. Fred, if you could also take that question.
Yeah, I think the mobilization is underway. It's true that a lot of people, a lot of my friends, don't want their sons going, and it has changed the temperature here because it's one thing when you have like volunteers and contract soldiers and those separatist militias doing the fighting, which has been the case for 7 months, and quite another thing when it's your husband, father, son being sent down there to do it. However, I think that the mobilization will go on. I would not underestimate the Russian potential to mobilize, hundreds of thousands of more troops, train them up and arm them, even though we do focus on those people at the border or trying to escape somewhere. That's a small minority. I think, I've seen the Voinkomat here in Moscow. It's full of people who are receiving their kit and being deployed out for more training. So I do think, I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying that by December or January, Russia will have a much larger force that will be quite capable to go on the offensive in Ukraine.
Right, and how the NATO plans to counter that is something also we'll have to look at and focus. I'm going to request you, gentlemen, to hold on to those thoughts. We also have a host of international reactions coming in from very crucial personalities. Let's also listen into those reactions, and I'll shortly come back to you after that.
The United States will never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory. This so-called referendum was a sham, an absolute sham. The results were manufactured in Moscow. And the true will of the Ukrainian people is evident every day as they sacrifice their lives to save their people and maintain the independence of their country and in defense of freedom as well. Russia's assault on Ukraine in pursuit of Putin's imperial ambitions is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The United Nations General Assembly is equally clear. In its landmark Friendly Relations Declaration of 24 October 1970, repeatedly cited the stating rules of general international law by the International Court of Justice, the General Assembly declared that the territory of a state shall not be the object of acquisition by another state resulting from the threat or use of force, and that no territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal.
Это позор и вранье с какими-то...
This shame and a lie with some kind of pseudo-referendums, confessions of some sort, and annexations will end for Russia in even greater shame. No one should take part in a shameful war. Dagestanists, Chechens, Ingush, Ossetians, and Circassians should not die in Ukraine, nor any other people who ended up under the Russian flag.
который оказался под российским флагом.
All right, those were some reactions coming in from three of the world's most prominent personalities. My guests continue to stay with me. Alexandra Matvichuk, if I could bring you in on the issue of mobilization. As we all know, that the partial mobilization ordered by the Russian president is the first ever since World War II. Having said that, you also heard what Fred Weir had to say. He's saying that he sounds very confident that by January, Russia will be able to prop up and, of course, fortify its defenses. What is the strategy that Ukraine has in mind, rather the West and, of course, NATO as well? To what extent is NATO going to defend Ukraine now?
Well, just one small correction. My last name is Mereshko, not Matvichuk. Well, and regarding your question...
my apologies to you.
Well, when you listen to Putin or Lavrov, they say that they are waging war not only against Ukraine, but against NATO, against, as they put it, the collective West. But NATO is not involved in this war because NATO is defense alliance. It can happen only if Russia, for example, attacks one of the NATO member countries. But how can NATO help us? NATO is helping, countries which are member states of NATO, they're helping us by providing military support, military aid, and technical support. And this is the most important support, the most important aid right now for us to survive and to defend ourselves effectively against external Russian aggression.
All right, Fred, how do you react to that now? Because, of course, there is an escalation which is going to be imminent. Is there any sign or hope for peace left for Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I am just in despair over the possibilities here. Russia is a big, powerful country. As far as I can see, the Putin regime is pretty solid. It's not panicking. The mobilization is taking place, and it's not just that they will put more troops on the ground, they will change their tactics. Until now, for instance, they have not bombed the railroad bridges over the Dnieper. They have left alone the railway system in general, for the most part. I think they're going to become far more aggressive in terms of destroying basic infrastructure, as well as when the ground hardens in the winter, probably going on the offensive. I'm terribly impressed with how the Ukrainians have fought. They've shown a lot of resistance and a lot of amazing spirit. I know several Russian war correspondents, and they also say that they admire Ukrainian fighting spirit. This is such a huge tragedy, and I'm afraid that Putin has made it even harder today to perhaps come to some kind of an accommodation, because wars all have to end. And they seldom do end with full satisfaction or full realization of international law. As much as you want to believe that aggressors will be punished, all through history they often get their way. So I don't know, but this is really today a deepening tragedy, and I can't see any way out of it.
Alexandra, there's the other question that comes to mind, which is now with the annexation happening, especially Zaporizhzhia, will also come to Moscow's nuclear subjection. And we all know how fragile the nuclear reactor is at a time when the UN has been pushing for a demilitarized zone around Zaporizhzhia. What is going to be the impact of the Russian occupation around Zaporizhzhia?
Well, as you can see, by blackmailing the whole world and threatening to use nuclear weapons, we can see that Russia and Putin is nothing but a nuclear terrorist, and it's very dangerous. But I still believe that he is bluffing, even though he might use any kind of provocation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It might happen because Putin is dangerous. He has cornered himself. But to prevent this, we need to do one thing altogether, the whole world. We should completely isolate the crazy dictator, because Putin is behaving as Hitler during the Second World War. He's trying to drag into his grave the whole country. And to prevent this, we should show more solidarity, and we should totally isolate Russia as rogue state, as terrorist state.
Fred Weir, is it fair to say that Putin is bluffing?
I have spent a lot of time asking a lot of Russian experts, foreign policy people, exactly this question, because it really is important to know what he meant in that speech last week, where he said, anyone who threatens our territorial integrity, because that was a change from Russian nuclear doctrine.
Right.
Russian nuclear doctrine says that nuclear weapons would be used only in the event of an existential threat to the state, or when nuclear weapons have already been used against Russia. He moved the needle on that. Maybe he meant it, maybe he didn't. But whatever the case, once Russia declares that these territories are now part of Russian Federation, then the nuclear deterrent will apply to them. It doesn't necessarily mean that if someone attacks those territories, they will fire back with nuclear weapons. In fact, Ukrainian forces have been attacking Russian territory from the beginning of this war. So the Russians don't shoot back with nukes. But this has changed the situation and made it like not only more dangerous.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, because I'm running short of time. And my last question to both of you, let me actually take that from my second guest as well. How critical will be the UNSC resolution now, and the responses of India and China with regards to the UNSC resolution condemning the annexation referendums that will be passed today? Alexandra, can you hear me?
You mean, yeah, it's a question to me?
Yes.
Sorry.
Right.
The resolution, UN resolution, if we're talking about General Assembly, has only recommendatory character. Obligatory character has resolutions of Security Council. But unfortunately, because Russia will be using its veto power, we cannot hope to get such resolution. But at the same time, I'm sure that Putin threats and his blackmail, his bluffing, will cause such countries as India and China to understand that Putin is dangerous. And they will also try to influence him, to put pressure on him to stop his very dangerous for the whole world behavior.
All right. Many thanks to you, Alexandra and Fred Weir, for joining our discussion today. And with that, it's a wrap of this newscast. And before I do that, let's also bring you another story. When we talk about designer labels, the first thought that comes to our mind is that it will be expensive or out of reach for a common man. Now, a new marketplace called Brand New that curates lifestyle brands by designers all over the world, Brand New, is